property to the antibody. It's not like it sends out a billion antibodies and hopefully one of them binds. You do get the correct antibody being produced.
No, but actually, doesn't the body make millions of different antibody-producing cells that each have a unique, randomly generated antibody as far as it looks? And twins will even generate different sets of antibodies,
well,
right?
depending on the antigens they're exposed to, right?
That just selects which ones are going to...
Well, it selects which ones are going to be expressed, right?
Right. And anyway, so there's a process where just through living cells reproducing and a natural selection of which antigens come in, that actually we are able to generate antibodies that can fight and recognize pretty much anything that comes our way, even though there was no anticipation of what that was going to be.
But I have no idea, as we just explained, I have no idea how that serves as a model for evolutionary development generation to generation. I have no idea how that works, how that would work as a model.
No, it's just a model of random mutation plus selection and in a living cell that reproduces, which is very different than a typewriter.
With some very nice, with some very nice recombination systems already there in existence to begin with, to put these things together. Yeah.
Exactly.
See, so we come back again, it's the evolution that claims to account for the origin of these things. And here's the mechanism we're going to account for the origin of these things, and I say, but that mechanism does not give you those things. That's not what you get.
Great.
So,
I think we can open it.
All right. Thank you, gentlemen, for that.
Thank you.
A good discussion. We will now open the debate to questions from the audience. If you would like to ask a question, please approach the Socratic members on the right and left aisles. Please ask no more than one question into the microphone clearly and swiftly. Please offer no statements. I cannot emphasize that enough. I ask that you keep your questions cordial and respectful. If at any point your question is accusatory or harsh, the Socratic member may take the microphone away from you. So, gentlemen on the left, you can start with your first question.
Question of Dr. Anderson.
Yes.
I'm surprised that you recognize the Cambrian geological epoch.
I said from an evolutionary perspective. I didn't say...
My question is...
I accepted that.
My question is, which race of humans is the most degenerate?
Race of humans is the most degenerate. I'm not an evolutionist, so I don't believe that races evolve separately or races evolve by an evolutionary process.
You said humans were perfect to start with and have degraded. That's their change.
Right.
Which is most degenerate?
I didn't know it had to be a competition between the different races. They're all different in what has happened to them genetically. So I don't know that there's really even an answer to be given to that, because there's no quantification of this one has, because as individuals we have pretty much equal number of mutations. They just affect different things, different processes in us. So one mutation can affect eye color. Is that more degenerative than a mutation that affects hair color? You tell me.
Dr. Karplus, would you like to answer?
Yeah, just I don't see the idea of humanity getting less and less capable if we look at the artifacts of how people lived before and how people live today. It just doesn't look to me like I'm much, much, much less fit to live on this earth than my...
I don't know. I would suggest probably by comparison to Adam, for example, if we want to start all the way back to the beginning, we're probably pretty wimpy, both mentally and physically. So,
which is a difficult comparison to make, right?
So I would say, if you want to start there, we definitely are not going in the up direction. So.
All right, on the right here.
Okay, for both gentlemen, please. You've been talking a lot about science, and I'm a little bit confused. It seems like there may be a couple of different kinds of science, and one is what we consider the scientific method, something that's observable, repeatable, falsifiable. And another kind would be, for example, forensic science, or how does something begin? And it seems, honestly, that you're both kind of mixing apples and oranges here, because, like, the difference between the creative processes that go into designing and rolling a car along an assembly line and turning a screw here and putting a bolt there is very different than the operational processes that make the car go after you drive it away. And it seems like what's often called science in refuting ideas of creation. It's actually, in fact, operational or well, just basically operational science. Whereas in dealing with the questions of origins, it's the principles of forensic science. They're very different things. Can you help me? I think I haven't heard from either of you how to distinguish those things. I think you both confused them.
Yeah, so I would acknowledge that there will never, ever be any scientific evidence that could prove that the world wasn't created 10,000 years ago to look like it looks, okay? And so evolution, talking about history, is one part, and evolutionary science also includes mechanisms that can be studied today as ongoing, right? And then using those mechanisms and talking about how they might have acted in the past to lead the evolutionary process. But in fact, what actually happened in the past is unknown and can only be pieced together by lots of indirect evidence, just like we know about electrons by indirect evidence. But evolution uses inferences that are really common for us every day. For instance, if you have a paternity trial, they do DNA tests of the 4 different dads that are potential, right? And one of them matches the kid. And so they say, you're the dad. But in fact, it still could be that there was another dad that was a match. Or it could be that God made that kid have the same DNA as that person, and just miraculously. I mean, so what actually happened historically, if we just say we're limited to natural processes as we explain things, because that's what we're going to do with our science, then we make the natural inference based on the evidence.
Well, you had mentioned the idea of the separation of the process of putting the car together and then driving it off, and that's one of the reasons I keep referring back to the origin of. Once you have it, then it's a different system, and once you have it, then you can introduce a degenerative mutation, for example, that will alter it phenotypically, but that degenerative mutation does not provide you an explanation of the origin of how you built the car to begin with. You know, if I'm driving the car, I can run out of gas, or if I'm driving the car, I can push on the accelerator. That's a different process. I'm moving, but that's a different process than how the car was built originally. So that's why I constantly am trying to distinguish what we have originally and the origin of it versus what we're seeing today, and what's your mechanism of how you accounted for its origin to begin with. So that's why I always try to, evolution purports that it explains the origin of these things. Say, okay, what's your mechanism for the origin of it? I totally agree with you in that we are talking about when it's a historical science. Clearly, we can't go back and reproduce that event. And so that does limit us. And that's one of the things I wish my scientific colleagues would be less arrogant about, is exactly that. It does limit us. We can't then say with absolute certainty, oh, you knothead stupid Christians, we know this is not the way it happens. You don't know. I heard Eugenia Scott admit we don't know where life came from, how it originated. Well, Eugenie, if we don't know where it came from, how can you be so certain it didn't come from God?
And what do I say to that? I
Well,
say, with our scientist hats on, we don't answer the question with that answer. And would say about the origin of life, we don't understand.
Yeah.
And by faith, I say, it did come from God, even if we have a physical explanation.
See, that's an area I will disagree with you, because I will say, with my scientist hat on, I would say the evidence is totally consistent with the idea that it came from God.
We'll move on to a new question. On the left.
Hi. Dr. Ensign, will you please comment on carbon dating? And because personally for me, it's been a roadblock in making evolution.
How is carbon dating, explain to me a little bit, how has carbon dating been a roadblock?
For instance, in science classes,
Will you speak into the microphone, please?
it's so short.
Yeah, there we go.
For instance, like in science classes that I've taken at this university and during my high school and middle school years, they say that carbon dating shows that the Earth is such and such years old. I don't know if you're a young Earth creationist or...
Yes, I am.
Okay. Can you please reconcile those apparent scientific facts with your belief?
Okay.
In less than 2 minutes.
Yeah, thanks, yeah. And then I'll explain God in the 3 seconds left over, right? Yeah. Okay. First off, I am not wearing a geophysicist hat. Okay, I'm a geneticist. So, you have to take with a little bit of grain of salt that I can't give you the full dynamic explanation. But first off, carbon dating is only applied to carbon-based materials. So clearly you can't apply carbon dating to geologic formations such as limestone or, I don't even remember rock, but anyway, you cannot apply it to rock in essence. So it has to be to the fossils, it has to be to other carbon materials such as diamonds, such as petrified wood, coal, and such. Okay. Second, it's pretty well recognized that after 50,000 years, they really don't have accuracy they're going to talk about. And in fact, they recognize that it starts getting inaccurate even when you get close to that. And in fact, I would argue there's a lot of evidence that even after you go just back a few thousand years, the accuracy begins to really show. Now, there has been, over the course of the last few years, some coming together of what's been reported in the literature for a long time, and that is that everything still contains carbon-14. And it's not background level, it's not a basal level. It is above background level. Even though a 10 million year old fossil or a 20 million year old petrified tree should be carbon dead, but they still contain carbon-14. So then that becomes the question, how do they still contain carbon-14? Well, maybe it is because they're not 10 or 20 million years old after all, and they're not carbon dead. See, so suddenly carbon-14 is actually beginning to show maybe things aren't so old after all. So then you get a whole controversy that geophysicists get into about really where's the carbon coming from and can you account for it from natural sources and such and back and forth. It becomes interesting, especially for geneticists who's not involved in that. But I find it very fascinating that nothing is carbon dead, but it should be carbon dead. Everything should be carbon dead for the most part that's older than just a few 100,000 years. And they're not. Even diamonds aren't carbon dead. And they should be, 100,000 times over. So maybe they're not so old after all. So suddenly carbon-14 maybe is telling a different story, and that is, these things aren't that old, because they're not carbon dead.